Welcome back everybody. In this video we're going to be taking a look at some compositional tricks which you can use in your woodland images to hopefully help you get some images which you're more pleased with. Woodlands tend to be quite a chaotic environment and it can be quite difficult to pick out compositions. So this is just a handful of tips and tricks which I've used to initially spot things which could look good, could make a nice image, and then some things which I make sure I do once I'm setting up my frame ready to take the photo. So yeah, I hope they help with your woodland images as well. I've come to this absolutely amazing location. It's a bit of a clearing just outside of the normal woods I go to, my regular woods. And it's got all these incredible birch trees. Yeah, they've got some great spring leaves on them at the moment. We've got a bit of an overcast day today. It might be nice to have a little bit of sunlight to backlight or illuminate some of the leaves, but I think either way, the compositional tricks we go through will still be really useful. So what I'm going to do now is I'll join you behind the camera and we'll set up a shot together and I'll talk you through some of the things which we're going through. Okay, so I've just come behind the camera now, just to explain the first bit of advice or tip that I have. And what I do is when I come to an area, I'm always on the lookout for repeating patterns or repeating trees or groups of trees. So in this case, you can see obviously these three trees here together. They have kind of a similar texture, similar look to them. It doesn't have to be that they're the same type of tree. It just could be some characteristics that they have that in common. And a group of three like this, three tends to be quite a pleasing thing in a composition, I found. That applies for other types of landscape photography as well, but a group of three tends to be kind of a pleasing thing to look at. But yeah, I just try to keep an eye out for groups of repetitive patterns or repetitive trees, so things that look similar, because having that repetition tends to give you a more pleasing image. Great, I'll get a couple of shots here. I think actually I prefer this one in a portrait, and I have taken some images at this area before in different times of the year. But yeah, I think that's just to cover the first point, which is to keep an eye out for repeating groups of trees or repeating patterns in the trees or in the foliage. Okay, so the sun's well and truly out now and it's getting pretty hot, but I just want to show you one more thing while we're in this area. So what I've done in this frame is I have this birch tree just set up here in the foreground, so it's nice and close. And then we have this trio of birch trees again in the mid sort of background. And what that does is it helps just create a nice sense of depth. We have kind of a lot more detail and texture, and you can see the scale of this one here. And then because we have a repeating element again throughout the frame and over here, just creates that sense of depth. So I think it's always really useful to try and find kind of an anchor point or a main tree in your composition. And then if you have repetition throughout, I think it really helps just to create that sense of scale and depth. Okay, so I think what we'll do now is we'll head to another part of the woodlands and we'll go through a few more tips which you can use in your woodland images. All right, see you there. In this area, we're going to take a look at the use of leading lines and the use of light in your woodland images in order to hopefully help you create some more pleasing compositions and something that's a bit nicer for the viewer's eye to go through. So firstly, if we just take this location I'm stood in at the moment, we have this great leading line all the way through it. So I've made use of a path and it's created this great little S-curve through the image. I did already cover this briefly in another video, but I thought we're going a bit more depth to it today. And yeah, so when you've got something like a path, it's a very obvious example of a leading line you can use in your image just to create that journey through the image for the viewer. But what we're going to look at now is some slightly less obvious examples of leading lines, and hopefully it will reinforce the fact that you should train your eye just to look out for different things and try out different things that could be used as leading lines. They can help to create a woodland image with a bit more interest and hopefully something that's a bit easier for the viewer to look through. Okay, so I'll hop behind the camera now and we'll take a look at some of these different leading lines you can use. Okay, so I've just come behind the camera now, just to show you a little bit more about the leading line I was talking about where I was standing. So it's just this nice S-curve. I'll just move the camera a little bit It's a nice S-curve we get all the way through the image, just making use of this path. I've used this scene before in the previous video, but I just wanted to show you because it's a really good example of a quite obvious leading line and making use of that path. So if you do spot something like a nice S-curve, it's definitely worth trying to incorporate into the image. But now if I just move forward just a little bit, over closer to this tree, we have an example of a slightly less obvious leading line. So on this tree, we've got quite a lot of texture, and texture is very, very important in the images as well, as I covered in the other location. But on this tree, we have these nice lines that have been left on it. And this is an example of a slightly less obvious leading line that I try to incorporate sometimes into images. And I think it can work really nicely in woodland images, just having kind of a subtle leading line. So you're kind of getting 2 for 1 here. You're getting this nice texture, and there's also, when the viewer looks over here, they can follow this line along and it travels back into this image over here. Sorry about the focus there. So yeah, that's just a nice example of a slightly less obvious leading line. So what we'll do now is we'll go and have a look at another couple of examples, just to help kind of show you some different options you could look at, or different things you might not have considered when you're looking for a leading line. Great, let's go and have a look. Okay, so I've just come to another spot, and here I'm looking at what I would call a less obvious leading line. Now, I'm not saying this is a good shot by any means. I just wanted to show you this to demonstrate the point. And what we have here is we have some bracken on the floor, and the stem of it here on the leaf is creating a bit of a leading line again over here through the image. And this is what I'd call as a bit more of a subtle leading line. And it's just something that might be worth training your eye to have a think about and have a look out for, rather than just looking for really obvious leading lines. You can see here as well, it just creates kind of a little bit of a journey through the image. So if the viewer's eye lands on here, it will travel through. I'd have to have a bit more of a look around and try and find a more pleasing composition incorporating this, but it's just to demonstrate the point. So I've just moved a bit further along into the woods from where I was. And in this area, I think it's a perfect place to show you about the use of side light and the use of backlight in woodland images. Quite often I'm taking woodland images in fog or bad weather conditions, but also making use of the sunlight when we have it like we do now can be really interesting for the images. It can create quite a nice atmosphere and a nice feel to them. This does mean getting up a bit earlier, so you're probably going to have to get up around sunrise. And depending on the time of the year, that can be very early, but it really, really pays off, because when the sun's a bit lower in the sky, it creates these nice lines and it creates these nice shafts of light through the woods. And a bit later in the day, the light becomes quite scattered and it's quite confusing, and it's difficult to get a nicer image. But yeah, as you can see behind me, we've just got these amazing rays of light coming through the image, and it really does amazing things for the atmosphere and just the feel of the image. I'll hop behind the camera now and we can have a little bit more of a look at it in detail. Okay, so I've just come to the other side of the camera now. I'll just move it slightly and I'll show you the sun's around up here. And because it's still quite early in the morning and it's quite low in the sky, it's creating these really amazing shadows and side light on the trees. So it's creating these light and dark regions, which is really amazing for your compositions to add a bit of depth. And it's also creating this nice sort of hazy feel coming in through these trees, and it's illuminating them. And I think that really adds to the atmosphere of the images. So yeah, just making use of the side light can be a really, really powerful tool in your compositions. If I waited another couple of hours, this would all become a bit more scattered and a bit more washed out. And it just wouldn't have that same sense of depth and atmosphere and have these really sharp contrasty shadow and light and dark patches. So yeah, that's just another quick tip about using the morning side light. Okay, another thing I wanted to show you while we're in this area is a really important thing of separating out the trees and trying to avoid too much overlap with all of the trees, because there's so much going on in the scene. It's really easy for it to become a bit too busy and too much going on. So just by taking a bit more time just to look at each of the trees or each of the elements in your image and checking that they've got a good amount of separation can really help with the images and just create something with a bit more impact. So what I'll do is I'll head behind the camera now and I'll just show you a bit more about what I mean. Okay, so I've just come to the other side of the camera now, and I'll just zoom in a little bit and I'll hopefully help to explain what I mean about separating out the elements, separating out your trees and the compositions. So in this shot we've got what I'd call our main sort of anchor point or foreground tree here. Then we've got one off in the midground over here, and then we've got the others off in the background. This scene's a little bit chaotic and busy today. We don't have any fog or anything to help separate everything out, but I think it's still good to help demonstrate that point of not creating too much overlap, at least on your main trees. So what I'll do is I'll just move this round for you, and if you just watch this tree and see what happens. Okay, there we go. Do you see this tree now? It's creating quite a lot of overlap with this one, and this has got overlap here. But if we just move back again, and there, you see, bingo, I call that the sweet spot. We've separated this one out, and now I'll just make a couple more little adjustments to the camera position. Like that. Did you see? So I see it's kind of like jigsaw pieces falling into place, or you could call it kind of like a sweet spot where the elements are all separated out. And when you've got quite a few different trees like this in the scene, it takes quite a lot of little adjustments just till you get the right spot exactly. I'll just move around a bit more. What I like to do is I like to move left to right, and I just keep an eye on my main kind of elements until they basically look the best that they can in the scene. They're separated out the most. So yeah, just avoiding any overlap of trees behind the tree, the side of the tree. So just keep a good focus on those. And then so I usually kind of start with my main tree or the nearest one. And then I look at my kind of secondary subjects and I separate those out. When it gets off into the background, like over there or something, it becomes pretty much impossible. So don't worry too much about that. But as long as your kind of main elements are separated out, I think it can really help just add a bit more impact into your woodland images. So yeah, just making lots of little micro adjustments like this until you find kind of a spot that you're happy with and separates out the trees a bit more. We've got a little bit still over here, so I'd probably still make a few more little adjustments. But I really hope that's helped show just how making small movements and just having a really good level of observation on your subjects can really pay off with your compositions and just help kind of separate everything out a bit more. Okay, so another thing which I wanted to share with you, and something I always look out for in my woodland images, and that's the use of texture. I think texture is always really interesting in images. It always really adds an extra element to them. And when you're looking around and you're trying to spot certain things, it's something I've trained myself to look out for in woodland images. As I said, it's quite chaotic, so anything you can kind of latch yourself onto and start forming your composition around can be really useful. So in this scene, for example, we've got this amazing ivy which has latched itself onto this tree. It's created this great texture. I think it has kind of an enchanted feel, and I like the feeling of it kind of being overgrown. It really works with the woodlands, I think. So yeah, just when you're walking around, have a little spot out for certain textures. It could be ferns, it could be, yeah, something like this, like ivy. It could just be the way the tree's trunk has kind of become all gnarled over time. So yeah, just textures really are useful in woodland images. Also in this same scene, we've created what I would call a good sense of contrast, and contrast is also really helpful in your woodland images. So we've got this tree here with this ivy growing on it, and then we've got this tree here which is completely plain, it hasn't got any on it. And I think just by having these two similar trees but with contrasting elements or contrasting textures really helps to create something a bit more interesting as well. So I hope that's helped explain the use of contrast and texture. And it helps you just to kind of train your eye to look out for those when you're out and about trying to find a little scene. So I've come to one final location for today's video, and that's to talk about something I think is really important in my woodland images, and I think it could be really useful for you as well. And that's the idea of incorporating human characteristics into the images. So looking for human characteristics in the trees. I've picked this location because we have this quite obvious example of what I call the skull tree or the pirate tree, which is just incredible. But you can go for less obvious things as well, like dances between trees or families of trees, like a mum, a dad and a child. And just looking out for those human characteristics is something that's really good to train your eye for and just look out for in the scenes, because I think it just adds that extra level of interest and kind of intrigue into the image. But yeah, what an amazing location. And I think what we'll do now is we'll head home, and I've got a few more tips to share with you, but I think it'll be a bit better to go through some example pictures to talk about those. So thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you inside. Okay, now that we're back home, I just had a couple of extra tips which I wanted to share with you, and I thought they'd just be a bit easier to show you on the computer with some past images I've taken. These are two things I've used frequently to improve my woodland images, and they've been really beneficial in helping me create more pleasing compositions and slightly more exciting and interesting images. The first one is to do with the use of colour. Now obviously colour is very important in any type of photography, but there's kind of a particular use of colour that I often go to in woodland photography, and that's to do with including an accent or a splash of colour. I've loaded up a couple of images on the computer and I'll explain a bit more about what I mean. Okay, to help explain what I mean about adding an accent or a splash of colour in your woodland images, I've loaded up two photos. Now these images are both taken at very different times of the year. One's in late autumn, kind of early winter time, and the other one was taken in very early spring, but they both use the same principle. As you can see in the autumn one, when I was out and about, I was looking out for little splashes of orange leaves, so the last of these kind of autumn leaves that are hanging onto the trees. It just creates this really lovely accent of colour, and just creates something that's a bit more interesting and a bit more exciting to look at. Now we've used the exact same thing in the spring image, only we've gone for these fresh green leaves, and it just helps to create a kind of a bit of contrast between the other colours in the scene, and just creates an area of interest for the eye to look at. Now it doesn't have to be that you just use leaves, it could be flowers in the woods, or it could be something a bit more subtle like the colour of the bark on the tree. But always just try to look out if there's anything which has got a little pop of colour which you can include, because it helps just to create something a bit more special and a bit more interesting. Okay, so I hope that's helped show how including a little accent or a splash of colour in your woodland images can help to create a kind of more exciting or interesting photo. Now the final thing that I wanted to share with you is to do with the benefits of repeatedly visiting the same area of woodlands time and time again. It's very important in any type of landscape photography to repeatedly visit the same location, but it's particularly important in woodland photography. And that's just because the environments are so dynamic and they're always changing. Even just day to day with the weather conditions or the time of day, the same scene can look completely different. And then also when you visit it at different times of the year and different seasons, it can be really drastic just how different the foliage and how the trees look. And it can be really beneficial to go there time and time again and see those changes and tweak your compositions. So I've just loaded some images up on the computer from areas I've visited frequently, and hopefully that'll help explain why it's so important. Okay, in order to help show you some of the benefits of repeatedly visiting the same area of woodlands time and time again, I've loaded up some images of those 3 birch trees which we saw at the start of the video. Now this area I visited in many different weather conditions, different times of the year, and you can see from the foggy scene, the spring kind of summer scene, the autumn scene, and this scene over in winter when I managed to get out there in the snow, the kind of change in the atmosphere and the feeling of the image is completely different. And it's really exciting just to keep going there in the different times of the year and see how much it changes, see how the colours change, see how the leaves and the interaction of the light with the trees changes. And just by going time and time again, you get to really know the area well, and you'll know what kind of things would look good at certain times of the year. And you'll just notice little differences and little changes each time. And it can really improve kind of the range of atmospheres and emotions you'll get out of that scene. Here's some other examples. These images, it's quite hard to believe, are actually taken 3 weeks apart, from the first one in the fog over to this one with the full bloom of bluebells. And the difference is really remarkable. We start off with quite a plain scene with no leaves whatsoever. The fog's obviously quite interesting. And then just 3 weeks later, we have completely full bloom bluebells covering everywhere, and all of the leaves have grown out in the trees. And that just shows you this same scene, you can get so many different variety of images out of it just by repeatedly visiting it. So another really beneficial point of visiting the same area of woodlands time and time again is, if I load up an image from this same area with the bluebells from around a year before, This was when I was just starting to get to know this area. I'd only been once or twice and I was just trying to find kind of compositions or something interesting. I didn't really understand the area I was in. But then I went to visit it maybe 30, 40 times throughout the year, and I really got to know it quite well. I got to know the spots that had really good compositions. I understood where the light was going to be at certain times of day, and I knew when the bluebells would look best. And I started looking for little details like the S-curves in the path like we covered earlier in the video, and also the best place to position my tripod to separate out the trees. And only through repeatedly visiting it in different weather conditions, different times of year, did I get to know that area really well. And by having that time to build up a connection with the area, I think it pays off massively in your photos because you understand that area really well and you're able to get the best out of it. Okay, so I really hope that's helped show you the benefits for your images of repeatedly visiting the same area of woodlands time and time again. But also, it's just really good fun. It's really exciting to see just how much one area can change depending on the weather, or the more drastic changes you get throughout the year as the seasons change. And that's one of the most fun things about woodland photography, that it's always changing and there's always something new to look for when you go out. This has just been a handful of tips which I wanted to share with you, and it's things that I use frequently when I'm out taking my woodland images. So I really hope it's been helpful for you. And if you're a bit new to woodland photography, hopefully it's helped give you something to start off looking for compositions, because it can be a little bit overwhelming when you first get into it. If you have found this video useful, I'd ask if you could hit the like and subscribe and the notification bell, because I'll have a lot more videos coming soon. And I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching, and I'll join you next time.